Am I audible, please?
Oh, yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I welcome all of the participants, our esteemed speakers for webinar series. And this is third webinar we are organizing with IIM Sirmaur. And I am very happy that we have a very distinguished speaker for
Now, from this proposition, what kind of policy prescription can be provided? First, advanced economy, which is like a superpower. For example, US. It makes sense to go and preempt a terrorist group, like going and completely wiping out a terrorist group. So it sends a very strong image for them and projects them as a hard power in the world. And it also lowers the probability of attack by the rational terrorist group. Similarly, a country like India, which projects itself to be the leader of the global south, so it also makes sense for us to take the lead and preempt uh, terrorist group, which subsequently leads to reduction in the likelihood of attack from the rational terrorists. Apart from that, in economies where uh, they are about to reach the full employment equilibrium, so the gain from spending on productive assets actually reduces. In that case, also it makes sense for the government to spend on um, counter-terrorist measures. Taking forward, the second proposition for this is the likelihood of opting out by the government increases with an increase in cost of an unsuccessful attack and increase in payoff of the terrorist group from not attacking and negotiating, and a decrease in payoff from a successful attack to the terrorist group. Again, the policy prescription from this is that the government is less likely to spend on counter-terrorist, more likely to spend on productive assets in case the cost of unsuccessful attack increases for the terrorist group. So it makes sense for the terrorist group not to attack. And how the government can do it? Government can say that if any kind of attack happens, there'll be higher punishment for those who are caught after an unsuccessful attack. And if the terrorist group is rational or the terrorists are rational, they will take that into account before maximizing their utility. Apart from that, when it leads to very bad publicity in the media for the terrorist group, so one of the objectives, and that's why they want media coverage. So if a failed attack happens, it leads to a lot of bad publicity for them. So in that case, also the likelihood of attack. And when the members of the group are on United Nations designated terrorist list, that stifles down the funds and resources to the group. Apart from that, the payout from not attacking negotiation increases for the terrorist group if the government allows the terrorist group to come to the mainstream. For example, what happened with ARC in Cambodia? They allowed the members to come back to the mainstream and live a normal life. Apart from that, countries which say that they have no negotiation policy, that also leads to reduction in likelihood of attack, and where the recruitment, even after successful attack, are not very high. So in that case, the government is actually de-radicalizing people, and there is effective grievance redressal in that particular country. So that's about the sequential part of the game. Then I have looked at the simultaneous part of the game. Then I've looked at the sequential move game, where one player moves first and then the other player takes the decision. So in this case, the irrational terrorist group is moving first. It is choosing between mimicking and not mimicking the rational terrorist group, and then the government takes the decision. The second part is where the rational terrorist group moves first, chooses to attack or not attack, and then the government comes in. Now, by solving it through backward induction, the Nash equilibrium for the irrational terrorist group is to not mimic and spend on anti-terrorist measure, whereas for the rational group, it is to not attack and opt out. Now, an important point to note here is that in case of simultaneous move game, there was no Nash equilibrium for the rational terrorist group, and we have to look at mixed strategy Nash. Whereas sequential move game, there is Nash which exists here. Now, if the first player is government instead of the terrorist group, for the irrational terrorist group, the Nash remains the same. It is to spend on anti-terrorist measure and not mimic. Whereas for the rational terrorist group, again, it changes from spending on anti-terrorist measure and not attacking. The proposition is that across all three parts, sequential moving, where it is the leader and government is follower, where the government is leader, irrational group is follower, and the simultaneous moving across all three parts of it, the Nash equilibrium remains the same. Whereas for the rational terrorist group, it actually changes. Now, in case where there is incomplete information, so if the government moves first and it doesn't know about the type of the terrorist group, and F is the probability that it is a rational terrorist group, 1 minus F is the probability that It is an irrational terrorist group. Now, in this case, the government plays deep, that is to spend on anti-terrorist measures. So the expected payoff is given by equation A5. Now, if government chooses to opt out, expected payoff is given by equation A6. If I compare these, so the proposition from this is that in case of incomplete information, the government should always spend on anti-terrorist measures and never choose to opt out. Now, that's the last part of my presentation, which talks about a costly leader type of. By costly leader, I mean that the government is moving first. It has no information about the type of the terrorist, whether it is rational or irrational. There is a cost which is attached to the fact that the government can gather intelligence about the type of terrorist group. However, intelligence is very expensive. It's not, it's not inexpensive. It's extremely expensive. So that hinders the intelligence efforts. Now, in the previous slide, I mentioned that the resources which are available to the government are limited. The government has to take a proper calculated decision whether it wants to spend and how much it wants to spend on gathering intelligence on the type of terrorist group. So this particular model here, I say that when if H is the probability of the group being irrational, and as I mentioned, the irrational terrorist group are lexicographic. So they will always attack. 1 minus H is the probability that the rational terrorist group is there. P is the probability that the government opts out. 1 minus P is the probability that the government spends on counter-terrorist measures. R, which lies between 0 and 1, is the probability that the government incurs the cost to get information on the type of terrorist group. Now, if the government gets to know it and it knows that it is irrational, when it will attack, the government will always spend on anti-terrorist measures, whereas if the government gets to know that it is rational, so there is a scope of negotiation. It becomes very important piece of information. And I've assumed theta to be the cost of information or intelligence in this case. So the rationale, as I mentioned, behind finding information of the type of terrorist group is to according to the type of terrorist group. So this intelligence can be gathered through spying and intelligence inputs and also through international cooperation. Now that's the game tree. In this case, the dotted line shows the incomplete information. The nature selects the type of the terrorist group. It can either be irrational or rational, and then their strategies. The government has the strategy of buying information and not buying information. And finally, they opt out or do not opt out. Now, I've solved for this game tree, and the perfect Bayesian equilibrium for this game is in the form where it says that for the irrational terrorist group, it is optimal to not mimic. For the rational terrorist group, it is optimal to not attack. For the government, it is important to buy information even if it is costly. And even in the case of rational terrorist group, also it needs to buy information, and the probability of attack will be 0. So in conclusion, we can say that whenever there is incomplete information, the government will always buy information about the type of terrorist group, even though information is costly, and act accordingly. So in this case, the irrational group will without mimicking the rational group, whereas the rational terrorist group will choose not to attack. So, if I have to summarize the entire thing, I said that there are two types of terrorist group, rational and irrational. Since the definition of terrorism is not universal, so the problem arises from that particular thing. And the government has limited resources. It can either spend on productive assets or spend on anti-terrorist measures. If the government is spending resources on productive assets, it leads to multiplier effect. If it's spending on anti-terrorist measure, it actually leads to funding of attack. The major policy prescription from this is for a country projecting itself to be the leader of global south or superpower, it makes sense to go and preempt a terrorist group. And a country which is near full employment, it also makes sense to spend on anti-terrorist measure. Apart from that, whenever there is incomplete information about the terrorist group, it becomes important for the government to procure the information, to gather information through intelligence, despite of the fact that intelligence is costly, and act according to the type of the terrorist group. So with that, I'll write off. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for a very detailed thorough research that you have done. And you gave an understanding of rational and irrational terrorism group. And like you concluded that not necessarily as part of your research, but what we actually lack is also a international definition of terrorism. So that is one very, very important aspect. The floor is open to any questions, comments, and suggestion. One question is coming from here on from our table. Our YP ma'am is asking, Mega is asking Aishwarya ma'am, that ma'am, what should be the policy implication of the study that you have proposed? Like, what would you propose to any government? Any takeaways?
Yes. So for that, as I mentioned, one of the most important things is to arrive at a universal definition of terrorism. That's first. We all have to come to the same table and decide on what we define terrorism as to, so that we don't have to distinguish between rational and irrational terrorism. First. Second, as I mentioned, for a country like India, it becomes important to go and preempt terrorist group. So, which helps us project ourselves as the leader of the global south. Apart from that, the third important policy prescription is to spend on intelligence to gather information about the type of terrorist group. Till the fact we don't have, till the time we don't have a definition, universal definition of terrorist group, even though that's costly. So these are the major three implications from this study.
Thank you, ma'am. One question or query is there for Kalpana, ma'am. Professor Sigamani has pointed out, he's congratulating on your research, and ma'am, he's asking that please share your views on the significance of regulatory and data driven governance and PPPs in promoting sustainable infrastructural projects, including interrelated projects in India.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sigamani Pannir. Let me take these two separately because both are significant. When you take the significance of the regulatory mechanism, in a PPP, this is extremely sensitive and tricky because remember that a normal understanding is of the government as the regulator. But in this, in an instance of a PPP, the government is also a partner. So it behoves on both partners to see that changes in the governmental or the political climate do not result in affect the dynamics of the partnership relationship. And therefore, it's important to prevent any kind of derailing of the project or changes in contractual conditions by putting in place in advance mechanisms for dispute resolution. And there's a very important concept in PPP literature called non-contractability. Everything, non-contractability basically means you can't foresee everything. In the instance which I narrated, nobody could have foreseen that Bangalore would grow like this, and it would be concentrated on one end of the city, most of the growth, whereas the airport is located at the opposite end of the city. So not even the city, in fact, it's outside in a different district, the opposite direction. So it even those non-contractability issues need to be foreseen. If not exactly, at least you need to put mechanisms in place that if such issues arise, then how would you deal with them? Would you deal with them by arbitration? Would you have a dispute resolution committee? So regulation becomes very important. Otherwise, everything would end up in a court of law and the project itself may get delayed indefinitely with both time implications and cost implications. Now, moving on to data-driven governance. Yes, data-driven governance, extremely useful. All data is useful. All information is useful. But again, beyond data, there lies a people. When you're dealing with a PPP, it is important because you're not just dealing with profit, but you're dealing with public interest. And therefore, one should not sacrifice people issues. And we saw in the very case that I narrated that technical and operational criteria were the constraint, and therefore the public reaction itself was not anticipated by the decision makers at that time. So one cannot sacrifice people issues for data or technical issues, and therefore there should always be that sanity so that balance prevails between these two. Not really contrarian viewpoints, but we need to be able to harmonize people versus data-driven governance. So that becomes very important in a PPP. I hope I have answered your question, Mr. Sigamani. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. I request DG sir if he has any final remarks to share. Okay. So on behalf of Chair, I would thank both the speakers for sharing a very, very delicate matters, I would say, as research, and very pertinent issues which might have inspired the participants here. So thank you both Kalpana ma'am and Aishwarya ma'am for sharing your researches with us. Thank you to participants for your active listening, and thanks to our NCGG team and DG sir for still participating in this webinar. Since he's traveling, he's still part of the seminar. I'm sure he's listening. So thank you all for joining in. This was third edition of our webinar series. We would be continuing to do so for next months, coming months also. So thank you, ma'am. Thank you everybody for joining in, and thank you to the NCGG team. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Megha. Thank you, Mr. Bagde. And nice to meet you, Dr. Aishwarya, and a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we close the meeting. Thank you.